Hey gang, welcome to the next session of Sales Lab. In this session we'll be talking about qualification and follow-up. But before I do that, let's just recap on what we covered on the social selling component of Sales Lab. We spoke about, just briefly, on how to build gravity. We spoke about the old versus new sales playbook. We spoke about the codex approach to outbound selling. I gave you a few templates that you can use in the process of selling online, and we spoke about the conversions, conversation cycle, which we will talk about again, and the overall formula and process. So this represents stage 3 of Sales Labs, so keep up the momentum, guys. You're doing a great job. In this session, we'll be talking about some social media tips in terms of the follow-up, this thing that I wanted to introduce called the communication gradient, which is super important, not just for sales, but also client relations management. Spoke about, I'm going to provide you a template for qualification and email follow-up, which is super useful. Spoke about the client first date in terms of your first interaction with the client. We'll be talking about my coffee cup rule for sales and qualification, some signals that the client won't actually qualify onto the next stage of the sales cycle. I'm going to reiterate what we spoke about on the conversation cycle, and then I'm going to introduce the concept of BAMFAM to you, which is a super important tool. But before we do that, let's just talk about the homework from the last session. So you were supposed to add 5 connections at least, gold stars if you did any more, 5 connections on your chosen social media platform, be it LinkedIn, Instagram or whatnot. Actually message those 5 complete strangers and then report back on your progress. So I really hope that you've had the opportunity to do that. Obviously, you know, the entire Codex Labs process is grounded in practical experience and exercises. So if you haven't done that, please do that now before you proceed any further. So I'm going to assume that you've done it and that we can move on to the next stage. So let's just talk about different social media platforms and how they can kind of interact in the context of business networking. So Twitter, I found, in terms of following people, is an absolute free-for-all, yeah? So you can just follow whomever you want because there's not this option on, accept or decline someone following you unless they've got a private account. So that's just part and parcel of the channel. LinkedIn, I have this thing called the business card rule. So if you've got a business card or you would otherwise have exchanged a business card, then it's a-okay to actually connect on LinkedIn. Now, Facebook and Instagram, I've said avoid at all costs. The one caveat I would put on Instagram in particular is that if the client or the industry that you're focusing on, where Instagram is a more important channel than, say, Twitter or LinkedIn, then by all means. Now, Facebook, on the other hand, is a bit tricky, right? Because essentially that's opening up your personal information. I would be reluctant to actually, friend someone and then vice versa, accept a friend request unless you're actually willing to share all of those personal details and stories with the counterparty, and then vice versa. So you've got to think about it from their perspective too. So let's just talk about the process. We covered this in in the sales administration component in the first session. But by now, by the time you're getting to this qualification stage, you should have the contact registered into the system. You should have the lead registered into the system. And basically, after this qualification process, assuming that we're going to go into the next stage, we'll want to convert that lead over into an opportunity. And that's the whole point of this session, is knowing when to actually move a lead into a qualified opportunity, or whether or not we're going to mark that lead as unqualified in the system. So in terms of the communication, once you've actually made the initial contact, I wanted to introduce you to this notion of the communication gradient. As I said from the outset, this applies just as well to client relationships as it does to the sales process, right? So on the vertical axis, I talk about the stakes, and on the horizontal axis, I talk about the channel or the medium at which you communicate with. So if it's a low stakes conversation, text, email, etc., is a-okay. If it's a high stakes conversation, on the other hand, then face-to-face meeting is preferred. So when I'm talking about stakes, I mean this with respect to in a sales environment, how big is the size of the retainer or the contract? and, you know, on a client relationship basis, how serious is the matter to be discussed, yeah? So if it's just a simple, hey, can you do my tax for the end of the year, $300 tax return job, that's okay communicating that via text or email or whatever you need to do. If it's a higher stake or higher gradient conversation, you may need to have that, you know, over the phone or in a face-to-face meeting. So just keep that one in mind. We talk about this in a client relationship context in service labs, where the example in client relationships is that if it's a run-of-the-mill ordinary business transaction like, hey, can you send me your documents to complete this tax return, that's fine over email. If it's a situation where the client is being acquired for $10 million, that will definitely necessitate a sit-down meeting with the client. Similarly, if they're, you know, if you've got an angry client for whatever reason, those situations are usually best diffused over the telephone or face-to-face, because in the context of communications, a lot of what gets said is actually non-verbal. So it's not actually the words that you're saying, it's how they're actually being said. That's communicating the bulk of the message, right? So a lot of that nuance in communication gets lost in translation via text and email communications. But then obviously in face-to-face or video call, a lot more of that nuance can actually be communicated through. So it's an important tip just to remember in the context of you doing your ordinary business. So now that we've spoken about that, the follow-up email after, you know, an interaction, be it a networking event, is a good example. Is a similar template to the outbound sales conversation that we had in the last session. So this is, hi Jim, dear Jim, it was great meeting you at insert event at insert venue. Here's a link to the Ryan Ellis ebook that I was telling you about. What we're trying to do here is, one, I remember your name, and this is not like a blanket spam email. I remember where I met you. Moreover, I'm reminding you where you met me, and also adding value to the conversation by going, you know, I remember what we spoke about, and I'm trying to add value in the context of this conversation. It's a great tool. So this is then the follow-up. So it's like, I would like to continue our conversation over coffee, which is basically saying, hey, I had fun, let's do it again. And you're assuming the transaction here, basically by saying, let's have coffee. So you're not asking, would I like to have coffee, or would you like to have coffee with me sometime? You're saying, hey, I had fun, you had fun, let's do it again. That's what we call assuming the transaction. The next one is happy to meet at your office, if that's easier. So that's saying, I'm busy, you're busy, and I value and respect your time. So by giving a selection of times, you can say, I'm available at 4 p.m. Tuesday, or, you know, 10 a.m. Thursday, being very specific about the times and dates. You're giving them a choice of times. So that's another tool we use in terms of assuming the transaction, is it's like, I assume that you want to actually meet face to face, yeah, here is a choice of times. So the decision is less about, do I want to meet with Chris, and it's more about what time is convenient for me to meet with Chris, okay? And that eliminates a lot of the friction between actually, you know, conducting the appointment. And an analogy I'd like to, you know, to give you is like, you've probably bumped into an old friend from let's say high school or college. You bumped into them at the supermarket, and there's usually a throwaway comment of, let's catch up sometime. And both of you know deep down that neither of you are actually going to catch up, right? It's just a throwaway comment, because the friction in between let's catch up and you actually catching up is way too high at that juncture. You know, if you were actually serious about meeting up with that person, you would go, hey, really keen to catch up with you. I'm available, you know, Friday night after work for drinks next week. Or we can catch up for a morning coffee on Tuesday morning this week, if that suits you. Which one do you prefer? And then suddenly we've gone from this vague let's catch up again sometime to specifically, I want to catch up, I assume you do too, or you'd tell me otherwise. Here is a selection of times and dates that we can actually facilitate that transaction. So when you give a prospect a choice of times, all they simply do is select which time works for them, and you've smoothed out a whole bunch of that back and forward email trying to make times work, right? So let's say that you've now booked the first date and you're now about to sit down with the client. In terms of venue, my preference is usually coffee shops next to or near the client's premises, namely because I want to make it easy for them to actually say yes to that transaction, and I'll do it at a coffee shop typically because they may want to discuss stuff that can't be said in earshot of the people that they work with, be it their staff or their co-workers. So I give them the option essentially of doing that offsite. If they really do want to do it at their office, then essentially they will intervene and say, actually, can you just meet me at my office? Instead of coffee, we've got a great coffee machine here. And in that case, you go absolutely yes, that's fine, and don't push the the offsite location more than you need to. With respect to food and drink, we typically go, or I typically lean for drinks. Yeah, if you will. So if it's earlier in the day, I will lean toward coffee. If it's later in the evening or after work, I'll lean for let's grab a beer or something like that. You exercise your discretion on that. It's very similar to dating, if you hadn't noticed. But the reason I opt for drinks over food is that can last for 15 minutes or it can last for 50 minutes, right? And it basically gives both people an out to exit the conversation earlier. If you're sitting down for a sit-down breakfast, lunch, or dinner, then you're both going to be tied to that interaction for at least an hour, and it's hard to kind of escape those. So if they've disqualified you and there's no business to be had, or vice versa, you still have to sort of finish the component of it. Absolutely, by all means, I do advocate for dinners, lunches, and breakfast with clients or very near close prospects. But on that first date, I recommend coffee or or a beer if necessary. Usually in this first date, just like in in real life, there's some degree of small talk. Now you need to be mindful of not having the entire encounter just comprised of conversations about the economy and politics and the weather and that sort of stuff. You really do want to get this into a qualifying sort of frame of mind, and we'll speak about that further on in this slide. So things that you're looking for in terms of disqualification or disqualifying vibes are whether or not they keep talking about their existing accountant and how much they love them. That's basically the same as going on a date and them talking about their boyfriend or girlfriend throughout the entire date. Clearly you're not going to get a follow-up date, right? So that's a disqualifying signal. Another one is the creepy client. I have had these come up before, and there's plenty of other partners where you just get weird, unsettling vibes. And the rule of thumb here with respect to creepiness, I suppose, is if you feel unsettled by this interaction just on the first date, then imagine having them as a client for the next 10 years, right? So if you're getting bad vibes, you can just sort of disqualify and disengage at that stage before the interaction has proceeded any further. Another one I see quite often is the tire kicker, and this is basically their price shopping. They may have an account already and they're just looking for an accountant that can do it cheaper. Those are not your ideal client because they will be constantly pressing you on fees and value and all of that sort of thing. And the reality is that Codex partners charge more than your average accountant, right? So if they're just kicking tires and they want to see if they can get it done cheaper, then that's a disqualifying signal to watch out for. Another one to be mindful of is when the agent stage is starting to get too old, right? So if it's taken you 3 to 4 weeks to even get a first coffee date locked in, imagine how long it's going to take them to get source documentation through to you when you're trying to prepare a tax return or a sales tax return or something similar, right? So I generally regard that as a disqualifying signal on my part, where it's I will just stop pursuing that lead or that prospect if it's too old, right? Particularly if the aging of it has been caused primarily by the client, right? If it's your own poor follow-up, then obviously that's on you. But oftentimes with respect to lead qualification, if they're not responding to emails or they keep emailing you back saying, hey, I don't have the bandwidth or the headspace for this right now, You know, obviously keep them warm as long as you can, but if it's getting too old, don't be afraid to actually disqualify it, right? And let them come back to you when it is in their headspace and they do have bandwidth for it. The other one I see oftentimes, especially if they're leads generated from networking events, is the old counter sale. So what you'll find is that they actually start trying to sell you something than the other way around. This particularly happens, you know, in a post-follow-up networking context where they think that they're selling you something, or they're trying to sell something to your clients and use you as a distributor for whatever they're selling. Be very aware of that. And the other one is just overall price sensitivity, in terms of like, I just simply cannot afford an accountant. I need an accountant, but you know, I don't have any money to pay one. The typical signals are when they're trying to offer you equity in exchange for work, or they're trying to you know, do an exchange of services or something like that, like the old quid pro quo type transaction or contra sale. Those are all disqualifying signals. So things that you should be talking about or asking is basically just on you know, the qualification checklist that or like script that we actually provide, right? So you want to keep it fairly light touch. You don't want to go into the nitty gritty, but it's open-ended questions like, you know, how did you get started in your business? What was your favorite thing about, you know, being in business? What's, you know, been the best moment? What's been the lowest moment? You just approach the meeting basically with a general curiosity about them and how they got started in their business, and you'll find that the conversation flows pretty naturally. So I'm not going to be overly prescriptive in the qualification stage of the meeting, more so in the scoping stage, because there's definitely stuff that you do need to actually cover off on. But what you're just trying to do here is have a natural conversation and try and feel the prospect out to whether or not they're qualified. So that being said, even though I'm not too prescriptive, I do have this golden rule. I call it the coffee cup rule. And this is simply that by the end of the conversation, your coffee cup should be empty and theirs should be cold. Okay? So what I mean by that is that they should be talking so much and you should be listening so much that all you need to do is ask a question, yeah, and take sips from your coffee while they're talking. And this is that whole question, paraphrase, anecdote formula. When you're running that formula correctly, they should be spending more time talking, and this is why I mean their coffee should be cold. So I actually use this as a gauge on how the conversation's actually going. So I'll just periodically check in on my cup and check in on their cup to see whether or not I'm on track or off track. So if my coffee cup is starting to get cold, then I need to go back to questions and listening because I'm talking about myself too much. And we all know that everyone's favorite subject of conversation is themselves. So if you're asking them questions about themselves and their business, something that they're clearly passionate about, then their coffee should be getting cold. So keep that in mind. It's a great little trick for actually to gauging how you're performing. So you'll remember in the last session, I introduced that question, paraphrase, anecdote formula. I just wanted to reiterate that because that's essentially how you should be running the qualification meeting as well, is basically expanding on the text conversation that you had or the conversation at a networking event that you had, but you're diving into more detail about them and their business. So just keep remembering that. It takes a while to kind of get, you know, soaked into your DNA so that you're just doing that intuitively. So just keep consciously practicing that until you absolutely nail it. Now, the last thing that you want to do with a qualification meeting is to bam-fam, which is basically book a meeting from a meeting, right? So this is absolutely essential in terms of moving leads through the qualification framework, is that if you've had this 15-minute coffee chat with them and you haven't disqualified them, and they haven't disqualified you, and if they have, you'll know about it, you want to basically book a follow-up meeting to go into scoping phase, right? So you can do that, and you absolutely should do that in the meeting, right? Going, you know, Tim, it's been great, you know, getting to know you more. I absolutely do think that I can help you out with some of those tax problems that you're having at the moment. Now's probably not the best time to be going through them. So why don't we actually just book a follow-up meeting at my office, and we can go through some of these in more detail, you know, in a subsequent meeting. So look, and you pull out your phone and goes, look, I'm available, you know, 2 p.m. on Thursday or or 4 p.m. and when you pull out your phone, they'll pull out their phone, and you're basically just comparing calendars on your phone until you can both agree on an appropriate time to meet, and then get that one locked in. So put it into your phone and send them the appointment on the spot, and you've basically bam-fammed them, okay? And then at that stage, we go into the scoping session. So before we dive into scoping, what we're going to talk about is products and services that you're actually going to be offering as an Acodex partner. So tune in for that one, and then in the subsequent session we'll be talking about the actual scoping meeting process. So tune in, and I'll catch you guys in the next session. Cheers.